We are particularly appreciative that so many of you are joining us during these really turbulent times. But while it may be a slower burn than an armed insurrection like we saw yesterday, the cyber attack that happened last spring and that was only more recently uncovered is a monumental national security event. So we are very lucky to have with us today some of the key players in investigating and mitigating the impact of the infiltration of federal agencies and as many as hundreds of America's largest corporations at the hands of Russia. With us today, we are fortunate to have with us Senator Mark Warner, the Vice Chair and soon, very soon to be Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator, we are so pleased that you could join us, particular after the very disturbing events of yesterday and your very, very long night. So thank you so much. We also have with us Kevin Mandia, Chief Executive Officer of FireEye, the global cybersecurity company, which is credited for uncovering the hack. We're certainly going to talk more about that. And Katie Masouras, founder and CEO of Luda Security. Katie is a noted authority on vulnerability disclosures and bug bounties. Our moderator today is John Carlin. He is the founding chair of the Aspen Institute Cybersecurity Program. He served as Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Justice Department in the Obama administration and is now global chair of the Risk and Crisis Management practice for the law firm Morrison and Foerster, where he's been on the front lines of this hack since the earliest discovery, working with his client FireEye to respond, which he, of course, and Kevin will talk about in a minute. One last piece of housekeeping, before I turn it over to John. John will moderate a conversation among the panelists for the first half of this session, and then we're going to get to your questions. If you look, you probably all know this by now, but if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see there is a Q&A button. Anytime starting now, you can enter your, click there, type your question. Please try to keep it as succinct as possible. And please, if you are comfortable doing so, add your name and your affiliation. It just adds, and your location, it adds some good context. So again, anytime you can put those there, we'll be going through them. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we will certainly get to as many as we can. And with that, I am now happy to turn it over to you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivian. I want to start with you, Kevin, and have you give an explanation for those tuning in as to how did you discover this, what's turned out to be unprecedented, perhaps in size, scope, and sophistication in terms of an attack by a foreign adversary? How did you discover it?
I'm on mute. John, there's initial detection, and then there's, doing the full forensic investigation and finding the back door. But I think you're alluding to how did we detect it in the first place? Is that correct?
That's right. And I just want to echo on and maybe make clear that this is an instance where it's a sophisticated foreign adversary. Mm-hmm. They had the potential to hack into thousands and thousands of companies. Apparently they have hacked into both commercial companies and in the hundreds, along with government agencies, and they went undetected for many months. Mm-hmm. And then it wasn't a government agency. It was you and your team who found them. And so first, right. Thank you, because it uncovered a threat to our national security, but also how that happened.
Well, I think first, we're not like every other company. What we do for a living is we have over 500 people that have thousands of hours a year of investigating computer security breaches. So as we're doing this call, John, we're doing over 155 security investigations worldwide. So hacking into us, I mean, what we do is we respond to that. But in this particular case, the event that got briefed to me that made us escalate and kind of declare this a full-blown incident was that somebody was accessing our network just like we do, but they were doing it with a second registered device. So we called that person and said, hey, did you just register a new phone? And he said, no. And that was actually, even though it's a severity 0 alert to some extent for us, that's what it got classified at. We had somebody bypassing our two-factor authentication by registering a new device and accessing our network just like our employees do, but it actually wasn't our employee doing it. And the minute we saw that, we recognized that's the kind of tradecraft the most advanced groups would do. The best hacks in the world, how about no malware? How about just use credentials and masquerade with all the noise by doing exactly what your employees do when they go to work every day? So we just detected it by seeing an anomalous login and basically saying, hey, John Smith, was that you logging in? No, it wasn't. Well, then it was a bad guy named John Smith logging in. So the bottom line, that's how we detected it.
And some people, I think, assume that, if you have the build a wall high enough or deep enough, you can keep a dedicated adversary out of an internet connected system. This, along with many other cases, I think is a wake-up call that even the best, you can't keep them out. What you can try to do is detect them once they're in. But here they got in through a particular means. People call the so-called supply chain or a software supply chain issue. You could just walk through a little bit what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. We just told you how we detected the breach, John. When we started doing our investigation, we had a network kind of pre-wired for this sort of thing, capture as many packets as possible, have forensic software on your endpoints. When we started investigating this, looking at thousands of computers, trying to figure out, have they been accessed unlawfully or without, by somebody without authorization, we kept backing into the earliest evidence of compromise for us, kept coming up a system that harbored the SolarWinds product. And after exhausting virtually every other means of entry, we decided it's time. You never want to start there and say, let's just reverse a platform that we bought from somebody, because most companies use hundreds, if not thousands of people's software, and to decompile it, reverse engineer it, and find malware in it when the malware is obfuscated is not a simple task. So we just kind of honed in on a particular server, happened to be SolarWinds, exhausted the forensic leads everywhere else and said, okay, we've got enough to go on now. So we decompiled, basically there was about 14 gigabytes of files that make up the platform. There's over 18,000 files, I believe. We kind of looked at 4,000 executable files, decompiled it into millions of lines of code, and then found 4,000 lines of code that were malicious. But it's not where you'd start. And that's the key to this. There's no magical wand that finds back doors in software that we all purchase and trust. And what led us to really do all that work, John, was in fact all the forensics, the thousands of hours of forensics we did prior to recognize that SolarWinds needed to be reversed. Thanks,
Kevin. And as we hear that, this threat actor happened to target the world's best investigative response firm, who was able to find, essentially through a haystack, the needle going through thousands of lines of code to find what had been hidden in what's an otherwise effective and useful product. Katie, you've been sounding the alarm bell about that for years. Could you walk through us, what should we learn from this software supply chain attack? And from your perspective, how does this differ from other major cybersecurity incidents?
Well, what Kevin was alluding to in terms of the means by which this actor got access to their systems is, exactly right in terms of what an attacker would want to do, as in masquerade as legitimate users. And they happen to do that through a software supply chain attack where, they compromise SolarWinds primarily and were able to forged signed updates by SolarWinds so that, this trusted vendor that is in, at least 33,000 different organizations with this software and 18,000 downloaded the backdoored version. That was where the software supply chain attack occurred. But the same type of access on a less savvy target than FireEye would have been phishing to achieve the same, type of result of getting in through and then masquerading as a trusted user to gain further access, post-exploitation type of activities to winnow your way further through a network is really, the parts of this type of attack that we've certainly all seen before. I think the unusual bits, that we have seen, some evidence of this happening in the past. CCleaner was one of the ones that was used in a wormable attack, and that software was also, backdoored in a similar way to SolarWinds, where the attackers first attacked that software, replaced the binaries with some malicious ones, and then those trusted binaries were then, installed as updates by the customers of CCleaner. So we've seen this type of technique used to affect the supply chain. And one thing that I think that people have been missing in terms of the overall plot of how unusual is this, is that the original software supply chain attack was your operating system, right? Way back in the days of, the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, really the software that lived on top of your operating system certainly was going to be vulnerable to security holes, as is every piece of software. But your trusted supplier, your trusted vendor that was, that could potentially affect every computer worldwide, at the time, it was over 90% Microsoft, right? So Microsoft itself was the original supply chain attack vector for most organizations. And that's something that, we try to sort of make this into a different thing and recategorize it as all new, but every single component of this attack is not new. I think that was your question. Maybe you had a follow-up that I haven't quite answered yet.
Well, maybe I'll just follow up a little bit on this, because there's been discussion, and Microsoft has publicly said both that, as you say, elements of their system were used to effectuate the hack, but also that they were hacked and that some of their code may have been at least viewed. What are we to make of that? And so many systems are reliant on Microsoft. What are people to do with that information?
Well, I think for consumers and the enterprise, the same thing that they always do, which is, trust that Microsoft is doing an investigation, much like FireEye had to do, to ensure that its systems are as clean as they could be. The fact of the matter is, what access to Microsoft source code really gets an attacker is potentially, some ways to find new vulnerabilities in order to exploit them. But a much more direct method, if they had access to Microsoft's network, is to go straight for the bug databases themselves and mine them for every single unpatched vulnerability that exists. Microsoft hasn't come forward and admitted any kind of access to its vulnerability databases internally, but that would be much more concerning to me. And quite frankly, if this attacker is as savvy as we all think they are, and
let me just pause you for a sec to make sure
Sure.
people are understanding what you're saying. So you're saying that Microsoft keeps a database that would show where there are bugs or vulnerabilities in their systems that could be exploited?
all software houses have to keep vulnerability databases if they are to track vulnerabilities in their code that they are working on. It's the same as any other bug database, and often they are the same database. So your general bugs and your security bugs, they all live in the same house in a lot of cases. Microsoft does have, some living in the same house as the product security team's bug databases, but this is a natural component for every single software house that cares about tracking its bugs, whether they're security bugs or non-security bugs. They have to have a database to track all of these things and the work in progress. So that's a normal part of business operations for software companies.
And we turn to Senator Warner, but just start by thanking you, Senator Warner, for joining us today. I think we all watched with distress and horror the events of yesterday, and your presence here, your actions last night are a demonstration to the world that is watching that violent thugs will not keep our democracy from working, and for our foreign nation adversaries that we remain on guard and able to handle the threats that they pose. Specifically, so thank you for being here, and specifically Russia, I want to talk about with you in relation to these events. The intelligence community has said that this was probably of Russian origin. What steps or actions are you contemplating? Do you think Congress should be contemplating to try to reduce the risk, number one, as we look forward to next year, and number two, to ensure that there are consequences for those that intrude upon our systems. Senator, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I think you've took me off now. Let me thank you for having me, and I do want to answer your question in a moment. I also want to acknowledge what you and Vivian already indicated, although it has been very rare that I've ever seen Kevin with a tie on. But Microsoft to a lesser degree, but FireEye in particular, what Kevin and his firm did was as candidly as kind of patriotic an action as I've seen from any enterprise for a long, long time. I think it has been clear that we might still not know, and this will go when I answer your question about kind of the necessity of reporting and what type of reporting. The fact that Kevin not only notified, but then laid out in full detail how the attacker did attack and the methodology used, the assets they got access to. They didn't have to do that. And we, USG writ large, but I think private sector as well, owe him and his firm a debt of gratitude. But I cannot, with this group here and with what's happened in the last 24 hours, not speak to it for a moment, because we're talking about here a nation state attacking or intruding. Again, even terminology we have to be careful with, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But intruding into government networks and private sector networks. And we have to be concerned about, what information they gained in kind of this great power competition. But whatever Russia, and we know who it was, and this White House again has watered down the attribution statements that should have been made in one more outrageous effort to constantly underestimate and underreport on Russian activity, whether it's election activity or otherwise. But for all the damage that was done in this intrusion, it pales in comparison to the damage done to our country in the last 24 hours. One of the things I'm proudest of in this job has been the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on foreign interference. I worked with Kevin on that, and he was helped educate me and a lot of my colleagues. One of our top recommendations out of that report was that any candidate or elected official ought to tread very gently and carefully when you go out and question the integrity of our elections. Because at the end of the day, what we have always presented ourselves is that our democracy is different, that we abide by rule of law, that we adhere to a set of standards, that we had peaceful transfer to power. That is more powerful for our country than all the planes and ships and bombs that we have. And in Donald Trump, we have someone who's abused that to an unprecedented level. Before the election even took place, he was threatening to undermine it if he didn't win. He has lied repeatedly for the last 2 months, to the point that 35 to 40% of the American public don't believe the election returns, don't believe the recounts, don't believe our judicial system, and has led him and his enablers, which we then saw the logical conclusion of that kind of big lie and disinformation campaign, accelerated by countries like Russia through technology, take place and play out yesterday, where literally thousands of thugs took over the Capitol and desecrated the Senate, the House. 4 people were dead. 60 law enforcement officers are wounded. And the amount of damage, the physical damage to the building can be repaired. But last night, thank God, 90 plus senators of both parties stood up for the Constitution. But when I was not nearly as eloquent, but when I stood up, I broke the rules and showed a picture of what was on the front page of one of the German newspapers. These thugs in the halls of Congress. The images that have been conveyed around the world in the last 18 hours in every foreign press is a bigger gold mine and more priceless to Vladimir Putin than anything that Russia has obtained out of this intrusion. And until and unless all of us, I don't care who you supported for president, are willing to stand up for rule of law and willing to call out lies and disinformation and misinformation, then we're over here fighting this intrusion, which is serious. But when the whole basis of what is the strength of our system is at risk. And the collaborators are not simply those self-serving politicians who are actually raising money yesterday off of these crowds or giving fist salutes to these thugs. But the collaborators include some of the wealthiest companies in our country. The Facebooks, the Twitters, the Googles, who allowed this kind of disinformation, misinformation from foreign sources and outright lies to perpetrate their platforms in a way that 35 to 40% of American public believes that the election was stolen or manipulated or that our whole court system was wrong. And their 11th hour conversion now to suddenly take down Twitter's Facebook feed or to take down Trump's Facebook or Twitter feed for the last 2 weeks is way too little too late. If they had 1 ounce of the level of patriotism that Kevin Mandy and Fire Eyes had, we wouldn't be in this position. And I'm obviously pretty damn angry. My anger is not from the Senate Intelligence Committee chairmanship or as the Democratic Senate. My anger is as an American elected official who believes in this country and believes in our system, and it is under full frontal assault. So I'm happy to take on this question. I will answer it now. But for anybody on this line that thinks that the most important action is this Russian hack, when we saw the images, luckily we certified the election last night, and the vast majority, at least in the Senate, 90% plus, did the right thing. But the price we'll pay for those images about anything special about our democracy, or the fact that the Syrian government today attacked the hypocrisy of America calling itself a democracy, is going to be a much bigger price than the information that's being vacuumed up by Russia in this intrusion. And the fact that, again, as recently as a couple of days ago, the White House watered down the attribution responsibility is, again, an extraordinarily disturbing pattern of this White House's continual failure to call out Putin and his agents time and time again. Now, where do we go from here? You know, one of the questions that we are continuing to ask, and I've asked Kevin, and he's briefed my committee. We've asked the Microsoft folks. We're trying to ask USG. We had yesterday FBI, NSA, and CISA, as well as a representative from ODNI in before the committee. We have a huge amount of education to go. You know, I've got colleagues who are out there comparing this intrusion to Russian jets flying over, the Midwest of our country. It's not that. It's not a NotPetya denial of service, complete taking down of our system. But I do think we have to decide, is this within the bounds of acceptable espionage? Countries spy on each other. But the volume and level, both in terms of governmental entities and in terms of private sector enterprises, and the level of sophistication, as Kevin and Katie have already pointed out, ought to be alarming to all of us. The fact that, again, this administration got rid of their cybersecurity folks at the White House in their first weeks, one more indication of where at least they place this priority. We're gonna have a chance to turn the page in 14 days. But we need to at least start with how we define this, where this falls on this continuum. If you've got traditional espionage here and not NotPetya, denial of service and takedowns here. Where is this along that? We need to make clearer. This is something, and Kevin, since we visited, we need to make much clearer how many other foreign nations have been attacked, and they need to come forward so that we can create some level of international norm setting and some rules of the road. Because I think, as Kevin has pointed out, when a first-year adversary brings its A game against any enterprise, public or private, particularly on the non-classified side, chances are they're going to be successful. So better cyber hygiene alone is not going to win the battle here. We're going to need some international norm setting. And we're going to need, I think, a fulsome review of the obligations of reporting from public, the fact that the public enterprises don't even have to fully report the system, let alone the fact that the private sector, if a company doesn't reach materiality, has no obligation to report. I think needs to be fully reviewed. So we got to educate our colleagues, we got to set some norms, and we have to look at the policies so we don't have to rely upon the goodwill and patriotism of somebody like Kevin Mandia to make sure our government was notified. Just think, when we see the abuse taking place and the lies and disinformation that are perpetrated on some of our social media platforms, if we had to wait for the same kind of patriotic leadership from Facebook, Google, and Twitter, we'd end up with thugs attacking the Capitol. Well, that's what frickin' happened. And before we kind of realize that yesterday changed our country probably more than what the Russia attack is going to change, we got to look at both of these sides in terms of all of our obligations, I think, public sector and private sector, to both truth, the rule of law, to ferreting out the bad guys, calling them by name, and then having a counter strategy. And I apologize for going on a little bit, but it's been one hell of a last 24 hours. And again, we're going to get better. We will do better. Our country will get through this. But the images that are across the world of these thugs in our capital is going to do more damage to our country than anything Russia's done in this intrusion.
No, thank you, Senator, again, but both for being here and showing that regardless of the actions that they take, that you and your colleagues will not be cowed and that democracy will continue. And I want to, a lot of the important threads in what you said to follow up on a little bit with the panelists. So heard is, one, there's the problem of allowing inaccurate information, false information to flourish and incitement to occur on social media platforms. And we've seen that problem as one that's been amplified, sometimes originated by foreign actors, in the case of Russia. And I think the senator is pointing out that sometimes it's not, there may not be a foreign actor, or the foreign actor may not even be amplifying it, but it is still a threat to our democracy if it's not appropriately monitored. I know that, Kevin, that's not your area. I might turn to Katie to see if you have thoughts on that. And then secondly, because I'll open this up to a little group, the senator also touched on the fact that as we look at the range of activity that foreign actors can take against the United States through cyberspace, you have that threat amplification of false information. You have intrusions into systems, and intrusions can be used to cause damage, like NotPetya. They can be used to steal information with economic value, as we've seen in the case of China, among others. But in this instance, it looks like the motive behind the attack was the collection of intelligence. It was done on scale, and it was done through supply chain, but does that make it different, or is this more routine intelligence collection? So Katie, maybe I'll start with you, and Kevin, I'll turn to you on the intrusion questions and where we should draw lines.
Well, so I'm not clear what question you're asking me, Ben.
So yeah, for you, I'm curious, what do you think of the responsibility of social media platforms to police content, particularly content that might be used to incite violence or other activities? And how do you distinguish that between intrusion or nation state amplification activity?
Well, social media is not actually my area either. But what I would say is, the disinformation campaigns that we've seen, they will leverage whatever means necessary to drive further wedges through the existing divisions and inequity in our country. And what I think has been dramatic about the lateness of the response from social media companies has been there's clear evidence in other countries that this type of violence is fairly easy to incite and amplify and be used by sophisticated and unsophisticated actors all together. So they had ample evidence already that this kind of destabilization at a massive level, and galvanizing of folks who have extremist views and the grooming of extremists and the cultivating of additional extremists, especially in domestic terror situations here in the United States. We've had tons of evidence of this. So, I would say that this is definitely something that I hope that the next Congress takes on as, what exactly is their responsibility. But yeah, that's, not really my area. When what Senator Warner said that I noticed and picked up on is the idea of setting norms in cyberspace is one that is thrown around a whole lot. And where I keep having this feeling is much like yesterday was, I think, a huge surprise to everyone, what happened on Capitol Hill. Even though we all knew there was a potential for an explosive type of reaction, I don't think anyone could have predicted that kind of desecration of our democracy that happened yesterday. Similarly, in the norms category in cybersecurity, I have this growing feeling, and I have for several years since norms conversations have been, in my purview, and as I helped, renegotiate the Wassenaar arrangement for cyber export controls of cyber weapons on behalf of the United States as part of that official delegation. The idea of setting norms, it feels to me like we're in the decline of the digital Roman Empire, and we're trying to tell people that it's not okay to use elephants to cross the Alps. Meanwhile, they are using elephants to cross the Alps, and we will be overrun. And I think that the time for us to be considering what kind of norms we want to exemplify in the world with our own behavior, our own cyber espionage that we absolutely must be able to do, right? This is something that, every country with the capabilities is going to preserve their right and their ability to gather intelligence, elsewhere in the world, balancing what our example setting should be in terms of those behaviors and those acts, but also understanding that in the world of cyber, and when it comes to things that we'll loose hand call them cyber weapons, this is not something that we can narrowly define such that we can appropriately regulate those things. It's regulation of the behaviors and what you do with it, as opposed to the technology, that I want to make sure in these norms conversations that go forward, Senator, in the next administration, the next Congress, that these norms conversations have that nuance, that it's not the technology that needs to be, under these norms. It is the behavior that we all enact as a global community that hope to preserve order in the world in general.
Let me jump in on that, just to ask Kevin, what do we know about the motive of this operation? Are we assuming too much when we say that the motive was intelligence collection? Based on your experience over the years, are there things you can tell about the tradecraft or otherwise that indicate what the motive would be and what they actually accomplished?
Well, John, I'm going to do what every bad panelist does and answer the last question and then answer that question. One of the things about norms and listening to Katie, I recognize, just studying this for decades, hard to have norms for espionage. We can damn well have norms for ransomware. The whole world is sick of tolerating hospitals, pharma companies being ransomwared and watching billions of dollars leave the United States and other Western nations for the most part. And one of the best ways to crimp down on some of the bad actors that follow different norms in espionage is, in fact, to take a hard stand and have strong policy and international cooperation to shut down ransomware. So I think there are steps you can take, but in regards to espionage, thinking about it, there's too much asymmetry. there are too many nations that can't compete with us with tanks or dollars, but can win in cyber because we're in the glass house in cyberspace. So I'd recommend the espionage one. Hard to follow and find international norms for that. Of course, we can set an example and people will follow it. But in regards to criminal rules of engagement across the entire interwebs, that's very doable. And we got to stop tolerating what's happened over the last 12 months. 2020, without a doubt, the worst year for every chief information security officer in my 27 years of doing this. And it was driven by ransomware. So a policy on ransomware will, in fact, actually be invoking punishment against the very people that probably did the breach that we're discussing here today. In regards to what they were after, at least I can speak on behalf of FireEye. This was an attack that stage one was getting a backdoor in your network in the SolarWinds platform. Stage two was actually using that backdoor, where the first step was to get to domain credentials, a secret server, some kind of server that has user accounts and passphrases so that they can access your networks or the victim networks the same way the victim employees do. Stage three was primarily to get the token signing certs to access an O365 environment, probably mostly for email and specific people's emails. And stage four that I call other, and it would be dependent on the victim companies. At FireEye, they stole our red team tools. Those are tools we use to do proactive security assessments to see if attacks that we've responded to, and we've repurposed the malware for the most part, do those attacks work on our customers' networks? So for me, what I learned from this attack is, throughout my history, I haven't seen a whole lot of .coms compromised for this kind of espionage. I've seen it from China against the defense industrial base and hedge funds and everybody. But this group smells a little bit different, has consistencies with a different country. And .com always felt almost off limits in my 20-something years till this breach. But I'm not an expert on what's fair game and what's not fair game for espionage, but we lost our red team tools.
Well, I want to just speak up there about the precedents in the past of nation states attacking, private industry. We had the Sony attacks,
right,
which was nation state. We also had the Aurora attacks, and that was a decade, or at least over a decade ago at this point, where that was China. And they went for Google. This was another, they went for Google, they got Microsoft, Apple, a bunch of these different tech companies. But what was interesting, that was another software supply chain attack. Google had been running outdated versions, I think probably for some app compat testing internally, outdated versions of Internet Explorer inside of Google. And that is how China got in to Google, was some older versions of IE. So we have seen this pattern used, for over a decade in terms of attacking private companies, doing it en masse. I think, what I've noticed in the last 20 years of my career in cybersecurity is that we have these arcs of coverage, right? And so much of policy is shaped by news coverage. So much of news coverage is, shaped certainly by sources like us, but over the years, the amnesia that sets in, that this is something that we've seen before, or these components we've seen before, I think that clouds policy in a big way. And that's something that, hopefully with experts like Kevin and, hopefully the, other folks that the new administration will bring in that have real world expertise at this grand global scale, because there aren't that many companies that span the globe. I mean, certainly tons of them are in the United States, right? Technology companies that are part of the supply chain in the United States. But that also goes back to the fact that 2008 was when I created Microsoft Vulnerability Research, which sole purpose was to coordinate vulnerabilities that affected multiple parties, not just Microsoft, back in 2008, because there was already a need for that level of coordination across private companies. So anyway, I'm hopeful that because we lost time with the disorganization of the previous administration and its lack of focus and being in denial for various purposes of what we're up against cybersecurity wise as a nation, I think it's high time, and I have a lot of hope that we can start getting it right again.
Let me just jump into just, I agree with what Kitty said, that it's hard to attack the technology. It ought to be the usage. But there, again, and you guys have a lot more expertise than I, but there seems to be at least areas that ought to have some level of discussion here. It took us 3 years to pass a bill to have basic IoT cybersecurity standards. That's lunacy. When the government's spending billions of dollars buying devices that were unpatchable, that had embedded source, embedded access codes into them. The fact that we have, you mentioned this, Katie, that there are plenty of platform companies that have known invalid software out, and there are no repercussions, on that. Does there need to be a debate about a liability regime? Does there need to be a higher standard amongst companies who are doing patches as opposed to just basic security? Kevin, I think my understanding at least is the level of sophistication of this intrusion was such that while they got in the back door, they then went through the window, they were then inside, is the way you described. Thank God they only went at selected information because they wanted to narrow the universe to make sure they weren't detected.
Right.
But the ability, if they'd had other motives in terms of moving towards denial of service on a broad-based approach here, it could have been much, much worse. So, and I get this, the norm stuff is kind of squishy, but what I would hope we would get to, and my knowledge level amongst policymakers is high, but it's peanuts compared to you guys. So you got to help educate us. Is that, and why I do think there's still some goal in this in international. If this is simply, if the rest of the world views this as, all right, Russia's hitting the United States hitting Russia, and this is the back and forth just on their espionage battles, then they can turn a blind eye to it. But if this is suddenly a supply chain across a multiple of public and private enterprises in Germany and in the UK and Vietnam and a number of other places, and it's a level of intrusion that could lead to denial of service, maybe the attribution standards ought to be lower, and there ought to be, again, a uniform response that we're going to punch you back in a much harder way. And it also still begs a huge question, because the number of brand name players that are involved in this, what we call SolarWinds intrusion right now, that have not come forward, would surprise the hell out of many of the people watching this. And can we ever respond if there's not some requirement that there's some requirement of reporting here or some requirement of notification? And the idea of where we notify in our government right now, I get the fact that notifying the FBI, whose goal is not to stop attacks, but to actually investigate criminal procedure, may not be the right thing. Maybe there is some third-party intermediary. Maybe it is FireEye and Katie's firm that you turn to first. Maybe it's an industry standard, but there's got to be some notification process that's absent now. And we're not going to get it 100% right, but what we're getting now is pretty much all wrong. And again, even our top folks in USG have acknowledged that without FireEye's revelation, this intrusion that's been going on long over a year, as we all know, could still be going. That's not a good way to protect ourselves. That's like, counting on Facebook, Google, and Twitter to do the right things when you've got a disinformation source not only coming from the GRU, but coming from 1600 White Pennsylvania Avenue.
You referenced there the idea that currently there's insufficient reporting, and that perhaps we're not paying as much attention on the reporting to how to defend our systems or learn from it. A member of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, Alex Stamos, has called for the creation, and this has really been something around for decades, but for a version of the National Transportation Safety Board for cybersecurity incidents, so that there's a place to report it, and that the goal of the board is to learn from what's occurred in the incident. Right now, we have a patchwork of reporting requirements that primarily fall around the theft of personally identifiable information. But in this type of hack, that's often not at issue, doesn't trigger the reporting, and that reporting is usually to consumers and regulators, and maybe used to take affirmative action against the company, but it's not used to go into a repository for study. I think Alex has memorably put it for the hack that he lived through at Yahoo, that they did an incredible job finding out everything that occurred in that hack, but it all went to plaintiff's attorneys and is sitting there still, closed in litigation so that no one could have access to it. I'll open this up to the full panel. What do folks think about that idea of having a national board that could review these incidents?
I'll go ahead and quickly start. I think it's an interesting idea. I think there may even be similar, analogies in the financial sector where there is, short of the SEC, there is SIFMA and other kind of industry-related entities that are first line of defense to report to. I think it ought to be explored. Simply going to the FBI, or even simply going to CISA, and I think that Chris Krebs in particular did a great job there, particularly around our elections security. Isn't solving the problem. And listen, I've had bipartisan national breach notification legislation for 6 years. It's still crazy that we've got this quilt work of requirements. But if we're going to rely upon, as you said, either getting into the trial bar, or a company reaching materiality, or only PII as mandatorily reported, and then we simply have to rely on the goodwill of CEOs, to do the right thing. Thank God we had Kevin, but as we know, Facebook didn't do the right thing in 2016 when the Russians were all over their network.
Well, I was going to say that, it's an interesting idea, but it's also one, the reason why organizations don't volunteer this information to the government, or to even to, coordinating bodies amongst themselves at a certain size. Organizations, prefer to keep this in-house because often, more times than not, they are suffering from some level of cybersecurity hygiene negligence in some area. They missed something was left unsecured that should have been. And I think they're probably worried about the liability implications. So I think that, if it were to be explored, and Congress has the power to, include some sort of forgiveness for negligence in some instances that would be found as a result of these sort of group forensic activities, then that's potentially viable. But without that, I see no way that any organization would want to expose its internal flaws, its process failures, and its mistakes to a broad group. That being said, there's a wide berth of what's considered to be diligence versus negligence in what we've seen inside of organizations. And my biggest example in my area of expertise is what I call bug bounty Botox. When organizations say we care about security and we've got a bug bounty, and look at all the money we're paying in bug bounty. Well, you look under the hood and you just look at the bugs that they're getting from their bug bounty, and it's low-hanging fruit. Why didn't they catch that themselves? Why are they congratulating themselves and everybody else is congratulating them on this, this sort of performative security? So I'd worry about, organizations feeling like they had to hide every single, bit of where their processes and their patches fell down internally, and not having a really good way to gauge who's diligent versus negligent on a more holistic basis, as opposed to that one incident and that one thing that caused that particular intrusion or problem.
Well, let Kevin answer, but I mean, I got to just tell you, Katie, if we can allow the Equifax hack to be basically built in as just the cost of doing business, and there being no consequences, which in effect is what happened. They took a hit for a while. A CEO lost his job. but 146 million Americans' personal information was compromised by a foreign government. That's not a good long-term solution, respectfully.
Oh,
and
yeah.
if it puts too much burden on Equifax or private enterprise, so be it.
No, absolutely. And I'm interested to hear what Kevin has to think about this as well.
Yeah, I think, in regards to this topic, there is a need for a federal disclosure law, ultimately having a safe harbor in that law, so that, the operating principle for it is you make other American organizations more secure. That would work. The unfortunate burden that will come with that is the assessment of whether that company was negligent or not. And to me, it's hard to prove negligence when you have a foreign power that attacks you. So it's a tough one. For me, though, I like the idea of the NTSB for cyber. That does make sense. And maybe it depends on who attacks you. That kind of elevates or decreases your liabilities. Not all attacks are created equal. A lot of companies and regulated industries are expected to withstand greater attacks than certain industries. So there is no one standard. If you make cupcakes for a living, you're not expected to be Fort Knox. So it's a lot to sort out, but I think you could start with, if there's an attack against an organization, if they disclose certain things in a certain way that helps the rest of the nation defend itself and the rest of the organizations across the world to defend themselves, that should come with some sort of safe harbor. Or you're not going to get, to Katie's point, a whole lot of folks doing disclosure.
Switching focus for a second, I'm basing this off many of the great questions, and thank you to our audience for sending them. When it comes specifically to software and supply chain risk, there's been a focus on where it's made and who produces it. And when it comes to the government contracting, that's resulted in new rules about certain, depending on the sensitivity of the software. Sometimes it's only U.S. citizens. There was reporting in the New York Times about another variation, essentially, of this attack emanating out of the Czech Republic, but with Russian coders. There's been discussion on the Hill about how to address that. And again, I'll open this up to the full panel. But should there be rules or restrictions about where your supply chain is hosted and who works on it? And even if it's not a rule or regulation, particularly Kevin and Katie, what would you guys recommend to your customers or to companies that they should do to try to secure their supply chain?
Well, the question of should there be rules about where your software comes from? I again point to evidence where Russian spies were uncovered working for Microsoft as full-time employees. Do you remember this? This was about a decade ago. So I don't think excluding foreign outsourcing companies is really going to solve our problem unless you move in a very dark direction, in my opinion, of requiring American companies to hire only certain ethnicities and only certain citizens to work for them. So I think that one in my opinion, is going down the wrong path in terms of helping us secure ourselves. In terms of securing your supply chain, one, know what's in it. Two, understand that even as consumers, we're part of a software supply chain. How many of us have postponed applying our patches, right? When we're getting nagged to download the latest operating system on our phones. So, from the consumer to the enterprise to, my customers, which include governments, absolutely knowing what you have, knowing what their baseline level of responsiveness is to not just intrusions and incidents, but also non-emergency vulnerability reports is often a bellwether for, understanding how prepared is your supply chain to work with you end to end to secure some software. And I'd love to hear what Kevin and Senator Warner think.
Senator?
All right, let me jump in. I just think I would analogize, John, your question to a debate that I'm also engaged in around 5G and Huawei. And I agree with Katie, you don't want to wall off to certain ethnicities or only America only. Those are not, that is the kind of America only approach that we've seen recently, which is not a long-term success. I do think whether we're talking here on cyber/software. As an old telecom guy, I think you can do some of the same conversations around 5G and next generation telecom system development. I think, you know, what we are seeing play out, software, telecom, AI, quantum. We see, again, to Kevin's point, the asymmetric ability of a country that can't compete with us militarily, but can compete in this asymmetric sector. I think we're also seeing, particularly vis-a-vis China, a country that wants to set the rules, protocols, standards in all of these developing technologies. Their China Standards 2035 document ought to intimidate the heck out of all of us. You could imagine it being written in the Kennedy era in terms of America's goals going forward, and they've got the resources and assets behind that and capabilities. I do think in this, you know, I think there is this notional idea of a coalition of the willing that would include countries that may have a commonality around cyber standards, that may have a commonality around technology development, that may have a commonality in terms of belief in rule of law, that have belief in, for example, transparency, free human rights, that, you know, and again, I don't want to sound techno-nerdish here, but those standards are reflected in 5G standards. Those standards will be reflected in how you use facial recognition. Those standards will be reflected in AI or in as we move into the whole question around quantum. And I think there will be an opportunity here. These are hard things to think about these technology-related alliances in a 21st century way, the way we thought about military alliances, particularly in the 19th century, and then economic alliances in the 20th century. And that group of alliances ought to not just be Five Eyes or NATO, but it ought to be, you know, and some of the first folks that would sign up would be the Japans and South Koreas and Taiwans and Singapores and, you know, maybe the Indias and Israel. I think that the UK's got this, I think, something 12 idea out there. I think these ideas need to be explored, and whatever input I have into the next administration, I'm going to make that a priority. And I apologize, Ken, I'm going to have to sign off. Kevin, given the definitive answer on this, but let me just I'm sorry to have taken so much time on the answering the first question, but you know, if you walked around the floor of the Capitol and you see the destruction that took place in the last 24 hours, and you see the images around the world of what our democracy looks like, we all got to step up. The bad guys, I will stand by my initial statement, gained a lot more long-term out of what happened in the last 24 hours than they're going to gain out of this SolarWinds intrusion. And until and unless we're all willing, regardless of our partisan affiliation, to speak up for truth, we're up the creek. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And that actually brings us to the end of our time for the panel. So I want to thank both our other panelists. And there were so many questions. We tried to put them together to ask you some of them, but I want to thank our panelists, our participants, for the questions that they asked and for joining us today.